And then there's gaming, which is a whole other can of worms and could benefit from its own video. If you want to hear more about that, let us know in the comments down below. Have you ever turned on HDR in a game and thought, why does this look worse than SDR? How can I make it look better? Hey, I'm Sam, a display tester from RTINGS.com, and in this video, we're gonna fix HDR gaming. Okay, try to. Starting with your TV and ending with the HDR calibration tools built into your console. And if this kind of hands-on guide is your thing, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. By the end, you'll know which settings matter, which ones to leave alone, and how to calibrate HDR on PS5, Xbox, and Switch 2, so you're not fighting your TV every time you boot a new game. HDR, or High Dynamic Range, is meant to give you a bigger range between the darkest parts of the image and the brightest parts, while also allowing for richer color. In a good HDR presentation, dark scenes keep their depth without looking gray, and bright highlights have more intensity. For games, HDR can also be a massive visual upgrade. In a perfect world, the game knows what your display can do, sends the right signal, and your TV displays it without second guessing. When that happens, HDR looks clean and intentional. The problem is that gaming HDR sits right at the intersection of three things that all try to help at the same time: the console, the TV, and sometimes the game itself. If those pieces aren't aligned, you can end up with HDR that looks dim, overly bright in the midtones, clipped in the highlights, or lifted in the blacks. The good news is you can solve most of this in a few minutes. Let's dive in. Before you touch any HDR sliders on your console, start with the TV. Turn on game mode, or whatever your TV calls its low latency mode. On some TVs, it'll switch automatically when the console is detected using ALLM, which is auto low latency mode. If you have that option, it's worth enabling. Now that you're in game mode, you're going to check a few settings that tend to cause the biggest HDR problems. Go straight to color temperature, which is sometimes called white balance. A lot of TVs skew way too cool in game mode, which means whites look blue and skin tones can look pale. For most TVs, the most accurate option is usually warm, warm 1, warm 40, basically something with warm in it. You don't need to get lost in calibration tools here, you're just trying to avoid common ice blue game mode look and land closer to neutral. One of the most overlooked settings that can completely wreck HDR is HDMI black level, sometimes called black level or RGB range. You'll find this setting on both your TV and your console, and they need to match. If they don't, blacks won't look right. You'll either get raised blacks where dark scenes look gray, or crushed blacks where you lose shadow detail. The easiest rule is to set both sides to automatic when possible. Aside from that, you might want to check the sharpness setting, as some game modes tend to crank it way up. Similarly, some TVs really boost their color setting in game mode, so you might want to rein that in too. Now let's talk about the setting that changes HDR the most for games: tone mapping. HDR content is encoded using the PQ curve, which can represent extremely high brightness levels. Your TV often can't hit the full theoretical brightness range, so it has to map the game's HDR signal to what it can actually display. Most TVs give you 3 tone mapping options, and each one takes a different approach to HDR. Dynamic tone mapping off is the default reference option. The TV is usually aiming for a more stable, reference-style HDR presentation. It follows its normal PQ roll-off behavior, so bright highlights don't just slam into a hard ceiling and clip. Visually, that tends to look more consistent from scene to scene, and it often preserves highlight detail well. Dynamic tone mapping on is the make it pop option. The TV is actively adjusting the HDR mapping, often scene by scene, to keep the image bright and impactful. Compared to tone mapping off, this usually makes the whole image look brighter, especially in the midtones, because the TV is actively remapping the curve scene by scene. The trade-off is that it can also shift the intent of the scene. A night scene might end up looking like a late afternoon, or a dark lab is suddenly not so dark. Tone mapping on is best if you prefer a brighter, more impactful look, even if it's less faithful to the original vision. HGiG is the hands-off option, and the idea is to make HDR games more consistent by shifting the main tone mapping job to the console and the game instead of on the TV. HGiG stands for HDR Gaming Interest Group. It's usually the best starting point for HDR gaming. On the TV side, HGiG usually does 2 things in game mode. First, it disables extra dynamic tone mapping tricks. Second, it behaves like a hard clip at the TV's peak brightness instead of the TV trying to gently roll off the highlights on its own. When you switch to HGiG, the image can look darker than when tone mapping is set to on, That's not automatically a problem. It's often the result of the TV being less aggressive with mid-tone boosting. One more important detail is timing. If you're going to use HGiG, it's best to enable it before you calibrate HDR on your console, so the console calibrates to the correct behavior. This is also true if you want to use dynamic tone mapping on. Always set the TV to HGiG first, calibrate on the console, then switch dynamic tone mapping back on the TV. Now that the TV baseline is set, let's calibrate the console, starting with the PS5. Go to Settings, then Screen and Video, then Video Output, and look for HDR settings at the bottom. First, make sure HDR is set to on when supported and not always on. That way, your SDR games will output in SDR. If it's the first time you're connecting to your TV, the HDR calibration screen should open on its own. If not, open Adjust HDR. Then you'll go through 3 screens. On the first 2 screens, you set the peak brightness of your display. You adjust both until the symbol is barely visible. Then go 1 click further so it disappears. On the third screen, you're adjusting the darkest end of the range. If you're on an OLED, it's common to bring that slider all the way down to 0, because OLEDs can hit true blacks. If you're on an LED TV, follow the on-screen instructions and set it to the point where the symbol is just barely visible, since those displays don't have the same perfect black floor. On Xbox, the key tool is Calibrate HDR for games. This tool exists in Settings, under General, then TV and Display Options, under Setup. When you run the HDR calibration, you're going to see test patterns designed to set the darkest visible detail. On an OLED, you'll often end up at the minimum for the darkest detail step, because once again, it can hit true black. On an LED TV, don't force it to the minimum. Follow the pattern and stop where the instructions tell you. Otherwise, you can crush shadow detail. After that, set the brightest visible detail and then the maximum brightness. Your job is simple. Follow the on-screen instructions and adjust each slider until the pattern hits the barely visible point it asks for. As a reminder, if your TV has HGiG, turn it on before you do any of these calibrations. Nintendo Switch 2 adds a few more moving parts, but the core idea is the same. Set a good TV baseline, then calibrate the console. First, go to System Settings, then Display. Nintendo lists options like HDR output, RGB range, 120 Hz output, auto low latency mode, one more time, auto low latency mode, and adjust HDR. A quick quality of life tip before you do anything else, set HDR output to compatible software only. Nintendo explicitly offers that mode, and it helps you avoid forcing SDR titles into HDR output. And of course, make sure HDR is enabled at the top. Now, go into Adjust HDR. This screen has a simple visual target. Adjust until the icon on the right disappears, while still being able to see the one on the left. After a recent update, you can now press Y to see the numeric value of the setting in nits, which helps if you know how bright your TV can get. The next part that trips people up is what is commonly known as paper white, which is basically the baseline brightness of normal whites and midtones. Quick shout out to Vincent from HD TV Test. His breakdown of the Switch 2 paper white setting is what we used as a reference for this part. Now, if paper white is set too high, the whole image gets lifted, and highlights don't stand out the way they should. You might have previously seen paper white within the settings of individual games, especially if you're a PC gamer. Here, when Nintendo is asking you how bright you want the image to look, it's asking you to set the paper white value. This used to be quite annoying to set, as originally, prior to a few recent updates, Nintendo's paper white value was way too high, and there was no easy way to know what it was set to. If your console is using the latest firmware update, paper white now defaults to about 300 nits. That is slightly bright since the common reference is 200, but 300 works well for most people, especially in a well-lit room. So, for many of you, just don't change anything and leave it at default. If you instead like to game in a dark or dim room, you might want to set your paper white value to 200. An easy way to do that is to first get the slider all the way to the left, which is 50 nits, then click 5 times to the right, and voila, 200 nits. You then have a nice range between 200 and 300 nits to choose from if you'd like brighter than 200 but lower than 300. after you calibrate HDR at the console level, some games will still give you their own HDR sliders or calibration screens. That's normal. Some titles use the console calibration as a baseline, but a lot of games effectively do their own HDR mapping and can override those system settings. Some games ask you to give them your screen's max luminance in nits, which is straightforward, if you know what it is. Other games, however, use arbitrary numbers or percentages, and that's a bit more complicated. For these games, you just might have to Google them to find out what each number means in nits, which is unfortunate. For PC gamers, we're focusing on consoles here on purpose, because for TV gaming, that's where most people are at. PC HDR can look great, but it adds extra variables like GPU driver behavior, Windows HDR settings, and sometimes more complex calibration workflows. Windows 11 has a dedicated HDR calibration app that does basically the same thing as the console calibration screens, and these patterns are recommended by the HGiG. One last thing worth knowing about is Auto HDR. This is an Xbox and PC feature that can take some SDR games and convert them into an HDR output. The goal is to give older games a bit more highlight pop and a wider looking brightness range, even though those games weren't made in HDR. Sony and Nintendo don't really have an equivalent system-wide Auto HDR feature in the same way, as their Auto HDR feature doesn't do any conversion, it just tries to output SDR within an HDR container. The quick reality check is that Auto HDR can look great in some games, and just okay in others, because it's still a conversion and not a native HDR grade. So there you have it. If you follow those steps in order, HDR gaming stops being a guessing game. You get a consistent baseline across your consoles, and then any remaining weirdness is usually down to the individual game's HDR implementation and not your TV setup. Hope that helped. Would you like for us to follow this up with a PC-focused HDR gaming video? Please let us know in the comments. If you have any questions, our staff and community are on Discord too. Come and check us out.